On a distant planet, far from Earth, a prisoner sat in the cold, stone cell of an alien empire's high-security prison. His name was known to few, but his reputation spread like wildfire across the galaxy. A human, captured during a raid on an Imperial outpost, he was seen as nothing more than a traitor, an enemy of the Empire. To the Empire's rulers, he was just another obstacle in their mission to conquer the galaxy. But to the human, it was more personal. He had been sent on a mission to gather information, to expose the Empire's corrupt ways. Now he found himself in chains, staring at the cold, steel walls that separated him from the rest of the universe. The prison, perched on the barren outskirts of a planet in the alien empire, was notorious for holding high-value prisoners. Those who dared challenge the Empire's reign were sent here, their lives left to rot in isolation. The guards, cold and unyielding, watched over their prisoners like hawks, ensuring no escape, no hope. Today was no different. The human had been held in the darkest corner of the prison for weeks, interrogated countless times. Yet, despite the torture, the endless questions, he had never broken. He had learned to remain calm, to keep his thoughts focused. But deep down, he was growing restless. He knew he couldn't stay here forever. His mission wasn't over, and the galaxy needed to know the truth. As he sat in the cold, dim light of his cell, he couldn't help but think of the past, of Earth, of his family, of the life he once had. He had been a soldier, a part of a team that fought for freedom, for justice. But that world felt so far away now. Everything had changed, and now he was alone, imprisoned on a foreign world with no one to rely on except himself. Outside his cell, the air was tense with the arrival of someone important. The prison guards whispered to each other, their voices low and filled with respect. The human's eyes narrowed. He could sense the presence of someone powerful, someone in control. The door to his cell creaked open, and a figure entered. It was a woman, an alien, tall, regal, with sharp features that spoke of nobility. Her eyes, though cold and emotionless, flickered as they settled on him. This was no ordinary visitor. This was an alien princess, one of the Empire's elite. She was sent to oversee the prisoners and to make sure no one escaped. Her reputation preceded her. She was known for her ruthlessness, for her ability to crush any form of resistance. The human looked at her, his heart skipping a beat. There was something familiar about her, something he couldn't place. His mind raced, trying to remember where he had seen her before. Her eyes met his, and for a brief moment, he saw a flicker of recognition in her gaze. But it was gone just as quickly as it came. The princess took a step closer, her voice cold as she addressed him. "You're a traitor," she said, her voice sharp. "You'll never leave this place alive." The human didn't respond immediately. He simply stared at her, his mind still racing. There was something in her voice, something in her eyes, that stirred a memory deep within him. Who was she? Why did he feel like he knew her? The princess's gaze remained fixed on him, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she knew this prisoner, this human, more than just a nameless rebel. She felt a strange pull, an unsettling sense of familiarity. But she dismissed it, pushing the thought away. After all, he was just another enemy to deal with, or so she told herself. The door slammed shut behind her, leaving the human alone in his cell once more. But as the echo of her footsteps faded, he couldn't shake the feeling that their paths had crossed before. And somewhere, deep in his memories, he knew the truth would soon be revealed. The princess had no idea what she had just walked into. The human prisoner sat silently, his mind still reeling from the unexpected encounter. The words the princess had spoken echoed in his mind, but it wasn't just her words that unsettled him. It was the look in her eyes, the brief flicker of recognition that had passed between them, like a spark of something long buried. He leaned back against the cold stone wall of his cell, his shackles clinking softly as he adjusted his position. His thoughts raced. Who was she? Where had he seen her before? He knew that look, that fleeting recognition. It wasn't something that could be ignored. But how could it be? He had never set foot in this part of the galaxy, let alone met anyone from the imperial family. And yet, something about her face, her posture, it all felt so familiar. The princess had been quick to hide it, that brief moment of vulnerability. She had stepped back with all the grace and poise expected of her, her regal mask sliding back into place, as though nothing had happened. Her voice had been cold and commanding as she left the room, but he could tell there was something more. Something personal had sparked in her eyes. He wasn't imagining it. Hours passed in silence, with only the distant sounds of guards walking by and the occasional rustle of movement outside the prison's thick walls. The human tried to keep his thoughts focused, but the princess kept invading his mind. He had to know more. It wasn't until the following day, when the princess returned to oversee another round of interrogation, that he would have the answer. She entered the room with her usual composure, her dark eyes scanning him as if he were nothing more than a tool to be used. But this time, she didn't speak right away. She just stared at him, her gaze steady, like she was waiting for something, or perhaps realizing something. "Do you know who I am?" she asked, her voice quieter than usual. There was a softness to it that caught the prisoner off guard. This wasn't the princess he had expected. This was someone more unsure, more human than he had anticipated. The human met her gaze, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the weight of the moment, the tension thick in the air. "I know who you are," he replied, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "But you should know who I am too." For the first time, the princess's mask cracked. Her eyes widened slightly, her breath catching in her throat as the words seemed to hit her like a physical blow. "Impossible," she whispered, more to herself than to him. A long silence followed, the two of them staring at each other across the room. The years of separation, the vast distances between their worlds, seemed to melt away in that single moment. She saw him, truly saw him, no longer just a prisoner, but a ghost from her past. I remember you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But how?" The human smiled faintly, a bitter edge to his expression. "We were friends once. Before all this." He gestured around the room, as if the empire itself was a physical wall separating them from the past. "Before the wars. Before you became this." He struggled to find the right words, unable to truly express the depth of what had changed between them. "Before you became this stranger." Her face paled as the memories came flooding back. A time when she had been more than a princess, when she had been a young girl, free of the chains of royal duty. They had laughed together, spoken of dreams and hopes for a peaceful future. But that was long ago, and the galaxy they once knew was no more. The princess took a slow, steady breath, her emotions swirling. "I thought you were gone. I thought you died in the war." "Many people thought that," the human replied quietly, his voice tinged with sadness. "But I'm still here, and I'm still fighting." The princess stared at him for a long moment, her mind struggling to reconcile the image of her old friend with the man in front of her. He was different now, hardened by years of struggle, but still, in some ways, the same. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice filled with a mix of guilt and disbelief. "I never wanted this." The human nodded, understanding her pain but knowing that words could not undo the past. "We can't change what happened, but we can decide what happens next." And in that moment, both of them realized that the game had changed. The princess might still be bound by her empire's rule, but somewhere inside, a seed of doubt had been planted. Her past had come back to haunt her, and she couldn't simply ignore it. The memories came rushing back to the princess in a wave, so sudden and intense that she had to close her eyes for a moment to steady herself. She saw a younger version of herself, not the royal figure she had become, but a carefree child playing in the gardens of her family's estate. The lush green fields, the soft sunlight filtering through the trees, and the laughter of her best friend. A human boy she had known as long as she could remember. She remembered his face clearly, even though the years had passed. His smile had always been infectious, full of warmth and joy. They were inseparable as children, their bond growing stronger as they spent countless hours together in the palace grounds. They had no concept of the empire or war then. The world seemed peaceful, their only concerns being the next game they would play or the next adventure they would have. In those days, there were no heavy expectations on her. The pressures of being a princess hadn't yet taken hold, and she was free to be herself. She would often run away from her royal duties to sneak away with her friend, running through the fields, climbing trees, and talking about dreams they both shared. He was the only one who ever made her feel like she wasn't just a princess, but a person, someone who could make her own choices. The princess smiled as she remembered the conversations they'd had late into the night. She had always admired his sense of fairness, his belief in justice. He would talk about how humans dreamed of peace, of a world where people of all kinds could live without fear. He wanted to change the world for the better, and she had believed in him wholeheartedly. But as they grew older, their worlds began to pull them apart. Her father, the emperor, had grown more powerful, expanding the empire's reach across the galaxy. Political alliances had been made, and her betrothal to a powerful alien prince had been arranged. She had no say in the matter. The duty to her family and the empire overshadowed everything, even her own happiness. Her friend had changed too. The ideals they had once shared seemed impossible in the face of the growing conflict in the galaxy. The wars had started, and he had joined the human forces, determined to fight for a cause he believed in. She remembered the last time she had seen him, a farewell that was colder than either of them had ever imagined. They had stood at the edge of the palace grounds, both unsure of what to say. His eyes had been filled with pain and regret. "I have to do this," he had said. "I can't just stand by while others suffer, but I'll always remember what we had. You're my friend always." She had nodded, trying to hold back the tears. She had wanted to say so much more, but the words had caught in her throat. He had turned and walked away, disappearing into the growing darkness. That was the last time she had seen him. War had torn them apart, and the years that followed had been filled with duty, politics, and the weight of the empire's growing influence. She had buried her memories of him, convinced that it was all part of the past, something that could never be reclaimed. But now, here he was, standing before her once more. He was no longer the boy she had known. He had become a soldier, hardened by battle, and yet there was still a part of him that she recognized. Despite everything that had changed, a piece of their old friendship remained, like a fragile thread that connected them even now. The princess wiped away a tear before it could fall. She couldn't afford to show weakness, not here, not in front of him. But deep inside, she felt the stirring of something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. The past was not as distant as she had thought, and perhaps, just perhaps, it could be the key to changing the future. The princess stood frozen in the dimly lit room, her thoughts a tangled mess of confusion and doubt. She had not expected this. The return of her old friend, the human soldier who had once been by her side. How could she face him now? He was a prisoner, an enemy of the empire, and yet his presence stirred something in her that she had buried long ago. Her royal duties, her loyalty to the empire, and her sense of responsibility weighed heavily on her heart. Her father, the emperor, had built his empire with strength and fear, crushing anyone who stood in his way. The princess had been trained to rule with authority, to stand firm in the face of opposition, to protect the empire's interests. But standing in front of her old friend, she questioned everything she had been taught. Could she truly continue to support the empire when it meant holding him captive, when it meant perpetuating a system that destroyed everything she had once believed in? She paced back and forth in her private quarters, her hands trembling slightly. The decision was not as simple as she had hoped. On one hand, there was the duty she had been raised to fulfill, the duty to her father and the empire. She had been groomed for this role from birth, and she had always known that her personal feelings would never come before her responsibilities. But on the other hand, there was her old friend, the one person who had always treated her like an equal, the one person who had shown her kindness when she was nothing but a princess in a gilded cage. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how much she had changed since their childhood. The Empire had changed her, had molded her into someone who no longer recognized herself. She had once believed in peace, in justice, in the idea that people could come together despite their differences. But now, she felt trapped within the very system she had once hoped to improve. The door to her chambers opened, and a guard stepped inside, bowing low. "Your Highness," he said, his voice respectful, but carrying a hint of urgency. "The prisoner is asking to see you." The princess's heart skipped a beat. It had only been hours since their last conversation, but it felt like a lifetime. She had barely processed the weight of what he had said, but she knew she couldn't avoid him forever. She had to face him, had to confront the truth about the Empire and about herself. With a deep breath, she nodded. "Let him in." The guard stepped aside, and the human soldier entered the room, his hands still bound by chains, but his posture defiant as ever. His gaze met hers, and for a moment, they simply stood there, staring at each other. The tension between them was thick, but there was something else too, a quiet understanding, a shared history that neither of them could deny. "I didn't expect to see you again," the princess said, her voice softer than she intended. The soldier gave a wry smile. "I didn't expect to see you like this," he replied, his voice tinged with both admiration and sorrow. "But here we are." She stepped closer to him, her eyes searching his face, trying to read the man he had become. There was a fire in his eyes, a determination she remembered from their youth, but there was also something hardened, something that spoke of battles fought and sacrifices made. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "My duty, it feels so different now. I can't just stand by and watch you suffer. I can't pretend that what we're doing here is right." The soldier's expression softened, and he took a small step forward, his chains clinking lightly. "You don't have to choose between us. The Empire has made its choice. Now it's your turn. You can be who you were always meant to be, or you can stay trapped in this role that's been forced on you." The princess's heart clenched at his words. He was right. She had been forced into a life she never chose, a life that had never felt like her own. And now, standing in front of her, was the one person who could help her find her true path. But that path would not be easy. Choosing it meant betraying her father, her family, and everything she had ever known. She took a deep breath, her hands shaking as she reached out, her fingers brushing against his chains. "I'll help you escape," she whispered, her voice steady with newfound resolve. "But I need to know more. I need to understand what's really going on. I need to know what I'm fighting for." The soldier nodded, a look of gratitude and trust in his eyes. "I'll tell you everything. But we have to move quickly. The longer we stay here, the harder it will be to get out." The princess nodded, feeling the weight of her decision settle on her shoulders. There was no turning back now. The days passed quickly, each one blending into the next as the princess and the human soldier worked together, secretly planning their escape. In the quiet of the princess's private chambers, they spoke in whispers, their voices barely rising above the sounds of the palace. The stakes were higher than ever, and every moment brought them closer to either freedom or ruin. The princess found herself drawn deeper into the soldier's world, the world of resistance, rebellion, and the fight for a better future. It was a world she had only ever heard of in passing, a world she had been taught to fear and distrust. But now she was beginning to see it through his eyes. He spoke of the Empire's corruption, of the countless lives destroyed by her father's greed. He shared stories of the oppressed, the ones who had no voice, no power. And in each story, she could hear the echoes of her own heart, a heart that had once dreamed of justice and peace. As they spent more time together, the princess could feel the walls she had built around herself beginning to crumble. She had always known there was something wrong with the Empire, but she had never allowed herself to question it. She had been raised to believe that the Empire was the only way, that its rule was necessary to maintain order. But now, As the soldier explained the truth, she felt a deep sense of guilt and shame. How many people had suffered because of the Empire's reign? How many lives had been lost? One night, as they sat together in the princess's quarters, the human soldier spoke softly, his voice heavy with the weight of everything he had seen. The Empire isn't just corrupt. It's a machine that crushes everything in its path. It's built on fear, on control. And you're a part of that machine. The princess's heart tightened at his words. She had always known her family's empire was brutal, but hearing it from him, the very person she had once considered a friend, made it feel real in a way she had never imagined. "I didn't choose this," she said, her voice filled with regret. "I never wanted to be a part of it, but I was born into it, and I didn't know any other way." The soldier looked at her with a mixture of compassion and understanding. "You don't have to stay a part of it," he said. "You have a choice. You can fight for the people who need you, for the ones who can't fight for themselves." The words hung in the air between them, a challenge and an invitation all at once. The princess felt a surge of emotion rise within her, anger, sadness, and a deep, burning desire for change. She knew that helping the soldier escape wasn't just about saving him. It was about saving herself from the life she had been forced into. It was about reclaiming her own destiny. The next day, they continued to work on their plan, carefully mapping out the prison's layout and searching for any weaknesses in the system. The princess used her royal access to gather information, moving through the palace unnoticed, her mind racing with the possibilities. She had spent her whole life under the Empire's thumb, but now, for the first time, she felt the freedom of choice. Every step they took brought them closer to their goal, but the risks were growing. The princess knew that if they were caught, there would be no turning back. Her father's wrath would be unrelenting, and the Empire would stop at nothing to find them. Still, she couldn't turn back now. She had made her choice, and with that choice came a new sense of purpose. She was no longer just a princess in a gilded cage. She was a rebel, a fighter for freedom. And she would do whatever it took to bring down the empire that had enslaved her people. As she looked at the soldier, she knew that their bond, once forged in the innocence of childhood, had transformed into something much stronger. It was now an alliance, a partnership built on shared values and a shared desire for a better future. Together, they would change the course of history. But first, they had to escape. The princess and the human soldier sat in the dim light of her quarters, a map of the prison and the palace spread out in front of them. They had spent countless hours planning, making sure every detail was accounted for. The escape was no longer a distant dream. It was within their reach. But they both knew that one mistake, one misstep, could lead to their capture, or worse, their deaths. The princess ran her fingers over the map, tracing the routes and exits with careful precision. "We'll need to move quickly," she said, her voice steady but tinged with worry. "The palace is heavily guarded, and the prison security is even worse. We'll need to get to the outer walls and find a way past the guards." The human soldier nodded, his face serious. "I've been watching the guards for days. There's a pattern to their patrols. If we time it right, we can slip through unnoticed." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small handheld device. It was an old piece of technology, one that had been smuggled into the prison by the resistance. The soldier had managed to get his hands on it during his time there. "This will disable the security systems around the prison gates," he explained. "But it won't last long. We'll need to be fast." The princess glanced at the device, her heart racing. She had never been part of a plan like this before, never had to rely on trickery and subterfuge. But she knew there was no other choice. The weight of the decision pressed heavily on her chest. If they succeeded, they would be free. If they failed, the consequences would be unimaginable. "We'll also need horses to get us out of the palace grounds," she said, her mind working quickly. "I'll make sure the stables are ready. We'll leave at midnight, when the guards change shifts." The soldier raised an eyebrow. "You think they'll just let us ride out of the palace?" The princess gave a small smile, the first sign of confidence she had shown in days. I have access to the royal stables. I can get us out without raising suspicion, but we can't afford to waste time." They both knew that time was their enemy. The longer they stayed within the palace walls, the more likely it was that someone would discover their plan. The princess had been using her royal status to move around unnoticed, but even her position could only protect her for so long. She would be missed soon, and when the emperor discovered her betrayal, he would stop at nothing to find her. "We'll need a distraction," the soldier said suddenly, looking up at the princess. "Something to draw attention away from us when we make our move." The princess thought for a moment. Her mind raced through the possibilities. "I can set off a fire alarm in the East Wing. It's a busy area, and no one will pay attention to the escape route while they deal with the fire." The soldier nodded approvingly. "That'll work. We'll have just enough time to get out before anyone notices." The princess's heart pounded in her chest as they finalized the last details of their plan. She had always known that the day would come when she would have to choose between duty and freedom. But now that the moment was here, it felt both thrilling and terrifying. She was about to risk everything for a chance at a new life. Her thoughts drifted to her father, the emperor, the man who had raised her, who had once been a symbol of strength and power. How could she betray him? How could she turn her back on everything she had known? But then she remembered the people suffering under the empire's rule, the lives crushed beneath the weight of her father's ambition. She remembered her friend, the human soldier, who had fought for what was right, no matter the cost. This was the right thing to do. It was the only thing she could do. "We're ready," the princess said, her voice firm with resolve. The soldier gave her a reassuring smile. "We'll make it. Together." And with that, they prepared to face the unknown, knowing that the road ahead would be dangerous, but also knowing that they had a chance, a real chance, to change the galaxy forever. The night had fallen, casting a deep shadow over the royal palace and the prison complex that lay beyond its walls. The cool air of the desert planet whispered through the narrow corridors of the palace, and the distant hum of the guards' patrols seemed to echo endlessly. It was a night like any other, except for one thing. Tonight, everything was about to change. The princess stood at the window of her quarters, gazing out at the stars. Her heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the weight of the decision she had made, the risk that she was about to take. Everything she had known, everything she had been raised to believe, was on the line. She had made her choice. There was no turning back now. The human soldier had been moved to the deepest part of the prison, away from prying eyes. They would meet there, in the shadows, just as they had planned. The princess had used her royal access to make sure that everything was in place. The horses were ready. The security systems would be down. The distraction, a fire in the East Wing, had already been set. It was their only chance. The princess's fingers brushed over the hidden communicator in her pocket. A signal to the soldier. He was ready. They were both ready. She glanced at the clock. It was time. With a deep breath, she turned and left the room. The palace seemed eerily quiet as she made her way through the halls. The guards, unaware of the escape plan, were focused on their patrols, never expecting the princess to betray them. Reaching the stairs that led to the prison, the princess's steps quickened. She could feel the tension building with each passing moment. When she arrived at the prison entrance, she paused. The soldier was waiting for her, his face a mask of determination. He was shackled, but his posture was strong, his eyes alert, and his mind sharp. "We're going," she whispered. He nodded, his expression softening for just a moment. "Let's go." The princess quickly disarmed the security system at the entrance, using her royal access codes. The door slid open with a soft hiss, and they moved inside. The plan was working so far. The princess's heart raced as she led the way, her hand resting on the communicator, ready to trigger the fire alarm in the East Wing. They reached the corridor where the human soldier had been kept. The prison was silent, the only sounds the distant echoes of guards in the halls. It felt like a dream, as if everything might fall apart at any moment. But they pressed on. The princess moved quickly to the soldier's cell, her hand shaking slightly as she unlocked the door. He stepped inside, and their eyes met for a brief moment. There was no time for words. They had to move. With a final glance around, the princess activated the fire alarm. The blaring sirens filled the air, signaling the beginning of their escape. She could hear the sounds of guards rushing in the opposite direction, away from their path. "Now," she said, and they both ran. The corridors of the prison seemed to stretch endlessly, but the princess had memorized the route. She led them through hidden passages, past rooms where soldiers would be scrambling to respond to the fire alarm. The palace was in chaos, but they still had to be fast. Finally, they'd reached the stables. The horses were ready, just as promised. The princess had chosen 2 swift steeds, their dark coats blending with the night. She mounted the first one, and the soldier climbed onto the second. They exchanged one last look, a silent agreement passing between them. The Empire was not going to get them without a fight. With a sharp kick, the horses galloped out of the stables and into the desert night. The princess's heart raced as they sped toward the outer walls. Behind them, the fire alarm still blared, the sound of chaos and confusion echoing across the palace. It was their chance, their only chance. As they neared the outer gates, the princess's pulse quickened. The last line of defense was in sight. They had to get past the guards. They had to break free. And in that moment, with the moonlit desert stretching out before them, they knew they had made it. The Empire's grip was slipping. The wind whipped through the night, carrying with it the dust of the barren desert planet. The princess and the human soldier rode hard, their horses' hooves pounding against the rocky terrain beneath them. The palace and its prison were far behind, but neither of them dared to slow down. The sound of pursuit was distant, but it wouldn't be long before the Empire's forces realized the princess was missing, and then they would hunt them both down. The princess pushed her horse faster, her heart beating in sync with the rhythm of the galloping hooves. She could feel the cool night air on her face, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. It was exhilarating. This was freedom, something she had never thought she would know again. Yet with every passing moment, fear gnawed at her. They weren't safe yet. They weren't even close. The human soldier glanced over at her, his face tense but determined. "We can't keep riding like this forever. The guards will have noticed we're gone by now. They'll send everything after us." "I know," the princess replied, her voice firm. "We need to find shelter. We'll stop at the old hideout near the canyon. It's been abandoned for years, but it should still be safe." The soldier nodded, not questioning her decision. He had come to trust her instincts over the past few days. They had worked together, planning, strategizing. He had never imagined that the daughter of the Empire's ruler would be capable of this kind of bravery. But here she was, leading them both into the unknown, willing to risk everything for a chance at freedom. The ride took them deeper into the desert, the stars above their heads flickering like tiny, distant fires. The landscape was barren, filled with jagged rocks and deep ravines, but the princess knew this land better than anyone. She had grown up here, in the heart of the Empire's palace, surrounded by the harsh beauty of the desert. It was a place that had always been both a prison and a playground for her, until now. After hours of riding, they finally reached the canyon. The entrance was hidden by a dense cluster of rocky outcrops, but the princess knew the way. She led them through a narrow path, the sound of their horses' hooves echoing off the canyon walls. At the end of the trail, nestled between the cliffs, was the old hideout, a small stone structure that had once been used by her father's soldiers for reconnaissance missions. They dismounted and led the horses into the shelter. The air inside the stone walls was cool, and the space was surprisingly dry despite the desert heat. The princess took a moment to catch her breath, her body aching from the long ride. But there was no time to rest. They had to keep moving. The soldier took a seat near the back wall, his eyes scanning the entrance as if he were expecting an attack at any moment. "We can't stay here long. The Empire will find us." The princess nodded, sitting down beside him. She had known this would be the hardest part, living with the constant fear of being hunted. But for the first time in her life, she felt alive. She wasn't just a princess. She wasn't bound by her father's empire. She was her own person, making her own choices. "We'll rest for a few hours," she said, her voice calm but determined. "Then we move on. We'll find the resistance, get the help we need to bring the empire down." The soldier looked at her, his expression softened. "You know, for someone who was born to rule, you sure make a great rebel." The princess smiled faintly, her gaze drifting toward the desert beyond. "Maybe I was meant to do this all along." And as they sat together, in the stillness of the canyon, the reality of their situation began to sink in. They were on the run now. No more royal titles. No more palace life. It was just them against the empire. But in that moment, the princess realized that this fight was not just for freedom. It was for something much more important, her future. And she was ready to fight for it. The days on the run felt like a blur to the princess. She and the human soldier moved constantly, never staying in one place too long. Each day brought new challenges, avoiding imperial patrols, finding food and water in the harsh desert, and constantly being on guard. But through it all, the princess felt something she hadn't felt in years: freedom. She was no longer bound by the palace walls, no longer playing the part of the dutiful daughter to an emperor who ruled with fear. Now, every decision she made was her own. It was terrifying, but it was also liberating. The human soldier had become her closest ally, and the bond between them had grown stronger. They had shared everything: stories of their past, their dreams, their fears. The soldier had shown her a world she never knew existed, a world of rebellion, of resistance, and of people fighting for something better. And as they traveled together, the princess realized that she had never truly understood what it meant to fight for freedom until now. They had reached the outskirts of a small village hidden deep within the desert. The village had been untouched by the empire's reach, a place where people lived quietly, away from the power struggles of the galaxy. It was a humble place, with dusty roads and simple homes made of clay and stone. But it was safe for now. The princess dismounted her horse and looked around at the village. The air was still, and the stars above were as clear as ever. She felt a sense of calm here, something she hadn't felt in a long time. "Is this it?" she asked the soldier, her voice low. "Are we safe here?" The soldier glanced around, scanning the surroundings. "For now, yes. But we need to stay hidden. We can't risk being spotted by any imperial patrols. We'll stay here for a while, gather supplies, and then move on. But this place is a good start." The princess nodded. She understood. Their journey wasn't over yet. The empire was vast, and their enemies were powerful. But she had come to realize something important over the past few days. She wasn't alone in this fight anymore, and she wasn't afraid. She looked at the soldier, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I don't know what would have happened without you," she said. "You've taught me so much." The soldier gave her a small smile. "We've learned from each other." They both looked up at the stars above them. The galaxy was still a dangerous place, filled with uncertainty and fear. But in that moment, the princess felt a sense of peace. She had chosen her path, and for the first time in her life, it felt like the right one. "We'll keep moving," she said quietly, her voice filled with determination. "We'll keep fighting. For them. For all of us," the soldier agreed. As they sat together under the vast, starry sky, the princess realized that their journey was just beginning. There would be more battles to fight, more decisions to make, and more challenges to face. But she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't the person she had been when she first left the palace. She was someone new, someone stronger, someone ready to change the galaxy. And she wouldn't stop until the empire was brought to its knees. The princess took a deep breath and stood up, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The future was uncertain, but she no longer feared it. She was ready for whatever came next. The princess stood on the edge of a hill, the cool desert wind brushing against her face. Below, the small village they had stayed in for the past week was peaceful, untouched by the Empire's shadow. For a moment, she allowed herself to breathe deeply, to enjoy the stillness and the quiet. It felt like a rare gift. It felt like hope. But hope, she knew, was fragile. The Empire was still out there, powerful and relentless. It hadn't forgotten her. And while the village was safe for now, they couldn't afford to stay too long. The moment the Emperor realized his daughter was gone, the hunt would begin. They would come for her, and they would stop at nothing to drag her back into the Empire's grip. She turned to the human soldier beside her. His face was weathered from their days on the run, but his eyes were steady, filled with the same determination that had driven him to fight for freedom long before they had met. They had come a long way. And now, standing on this hill, she realized that they were no longer just survivors. They were a force, and together, they could change everything. "Where do we go now?" she asked, her voice soft but resolute. The soldier looked out at the horizon, where the dark night sky met the endless sand. "We go to the resistance," he said. "We find the ones who are already fighting back against the Empire. We join them." She nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. She had heard stories of the resistance, of the brave souls who fought against the Empire's tyranny. They were scattered, hidden, and often crushed under the Empire's iron fist. But they were there, and they needed help. The princess had the power to do something, to make a difference. She had learned that from the soldier, her old friend. She had learned that she wasn't just a princess anymore. She was someone who could fight for what was right. "We'll need to be careful," she said. "The Empire will be watching every move we make. We can't risk drawing attention too soon." The soldier smiled, a flicker of pride in his eyes. "I know, but we've already taken the hardest step. You've already chosen. You're with us now." The princess felt a surge of determination. She wasn't just a pawn in someone else's game. She had a voice, and she was going to use it. Together with the resistance, she would stand up against her father's empire, against the cruelty and the injustice that had shaped her life for so long. They would fight for the future, for the people who had no voice, and for the chance to make things right. The road ahead was uncertain, and she knew that the battles would be fierce, but for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid. She had found her purpose. "We'll gather as many as we can," she said, her voice filled with quiet strength. "We'll build an army, and we'll bring down the Empire. Together." The soldier nodded, his expression fierce and full of resolve. Together. The princess took a final look at the village, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. This was just the beginning. She had left behind a life of luxury and privilege, but in return, she had found something far more precious: freedom, purpose, and the chance to make a real difference. She turned toward the horizon, her heart full of hope for the first time in years. They had a long way to go, but they would get there. And no matter what happened, she knew one thing for sure: she would never stop fighting. For herself, for the resistance, for the future. The princess was no longer just a royal. She was a fighter. And the Empire would soon learn that the fight for freedom was far from over. With the human soldier at her side, they began their journey into the unknown, ready to face whatever challenges awaited them. Together, they would change the galaxy.